Welcome to the In All Things podcast. Here, we talk about everything from friendship and personalities to contentment and faith. Our goal? To encourage you to seek Christ in all things. Hey, how's it going? I'm your host, Sierra. Let's imagine you're in my living room and dive into real conversation. Welcome back to In All Things. I am really looking forward to this conversation that I'm having today with my good friend, Rachel. We are going to be talking about purity culture. And before we dive into that conversation, I really wanted to introduce the concept of purity culture so that if you've never heard of it before, you at least have a brief idea of what that is. So purity culture was introduced by the church in the 90s as a response to the sexual revolution that happened in the 60s and 70s. And with the sexual revolution, that was where everyone was sleeping around, becoming very sexually promiscuous. And so the church responded to that by encouraging young people to stay pure and wait to have sex until marriage. And I want to make it abundantly clear that Rachel and I agree with that viewpoint. We believe that sex was designed by God for marriage. And so the thing that we recognize is that the purity movement had really good intentions because it was coming from churches and parents who saw the devastating effects of the sexual revolution, and they wanted their children to make wise choices, to make godly choices. And the Bible talks very clearly about purity. And so it all came from really good places and biblical places. However, purity culture took it really far. And that's what we are talking about today. So when we're talking about purity culture, we're not just talking about the idea of purity, because that is something, that foundation is something that we agree on. It's just to the extent that it was taken. So for example, one of the big ideas to come out of purity culture was the idea of courtship. And obviously courtship in and of itself was not originalized in purity culture in the 90s. But it was kind of brought back, if you will. And the idea of courtship is that if a guy is interested in a girl, he would get permission to court her or pursue her from her father or her parents. And they would enter into this courtship of getting to know each other intentionally. And of course, these rules would depend, but a lot of what was promoted is that almost all physical touch was off limits. And so there was no hand holding, there was no hugging, there was no kissing, and there was no sex. And if a hug was allowed, it would have probably been a side hug. And any time spent together would have been chaperoned. They would have had a sibling or a friend or a parent even be present for any interaction. So a courting couple would not be alone together at any point in time before marriage. And the idea then, the whole goal of that relationship was for it to lead to marriage. I want to say that if that is something that you are feeling called to and convicted about, by all means, pursue that. That is the Holy Spirit telling you that that is something that you need to consider. But the idea in purity culture was that that was the way to go. And if you didn't go that way, you were not honoring God with your relationship. And the truth is there's a lot of different ways to honor God in your relationship, and it looks different for everybody. When we put all these rules and regulations on something and we're adding to what the Bible is telling us, it becomes legalistic. And so my heart in this episode is that Rachel and I talking about this would encourage other people who have been negatively affected by purity culture, but that it would also encourage the next generation who isn't necessarily hearing about purity culture. They're going to be seeing the pendulum swinging back the other way, and that there is a middle ground between legalism and sexual promiscuity. And so today you'll hear Rachel and I talking a lot about that. So I just wanted to take that brief moment, explain what that was, and I really hope that you enjoy this conversation with Rachel. I'm so excited because I have my friend Rachel with me today on this episode.
Hello.
And we are going to talk a little bit about purity culture and how to respond to purity culture in a healthy and biblical way and change the way that we pursue relationships in the future.
Yes.
So, Rachel, before we start, can you just introduce yourself?
I would love to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Rachel. I am a wife to Jordan. He's insanely gorgeous. And 3 high energy, rambunctious, stubborn children. But amazing. They're amazing.
They're awesome.
They love Sierra. And let's see, I love learning about theology, and I love serving my church, and I'm a VA and a stay-at-home mom. So that is me in a nutshell right there.
All right. So we mentioned that we're going to talk about purity culture. So you want to tell us what purity culture is?
Yes, I am a product of purity culture. So fun. I was born in 91. So purity culture started in the late 90s. And it was a good intention, but bad execution. And it was really a response to the free love movement in the 60s and 70s. And so my parents were involved in that movement. They slept around, they did drugs, they were all part of that. And then the Jesus People movement also was in the 70s. And my parents got saved during that movement.
Very
And
cool.
so they grew up, had teenagers, and they're like, oh, we don't want them to be like what we did, you know? So it was really a response to that 60s and 70s free love movement. And so the pendulum just swung from one way to another, and it became, I mean, there were rallies, there were True Love Waits was like the whole the
slogan.
saying, the slogan, yeah. And purity rings. I had a purity ring.
I had a purity.
Until I got married. I gave it back to my parents when I got married.
So I'm going to interrupt you really quick because I just want to explain what purity rings are and what they symbolized for anybody who doesn't know what that is. So purity rings are a symbol of a girl's heart. And they were given, boys and girls wore them, but it was a lot more popular with girls, probably because it was a piece of jewelry. But they were given by parents, and it signified that a girl's heart was protected by her father and that she was under his authority. So then on her wedding day, like Rachel just mentioned, she gave hers back to her dad when she was married. That's because it signified then that her heart was now protected by her husband. So she gave her ring back to her father. And that was kind of what that was about. So it was a symbol for being under your dad's authority, but it was also a reminder, a physical reminder for yourself, that you had made a commitment to the Lord to stay pure.
Does anybody remember the Rebecca St. James song, Wait For You? Like,
I listen to that sometimes still.
Yeah, so good.
Because it is a good song.
It's a great song. But that was like the anthem of the purity movement.
Yes.
And it was mainly evangelicals. It was evangelicals who started this movement. And then Joshua Harris's book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, was like the holy grail of the purity movement. I remember my mom wanted us to read it, and I refused. Actually, all of my siblings refused.
Oh, interesting.
Apparently we don't like to kiss dating goodbye, but even at like the tender age that I was, I think I was like 11 or 12. I was like, I'm not going to read that. That's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. And so a lot of people blame Joshua Harris for their problems, which they probably shouldn't. And it put the majority of the pressure on girls to be pure. And they're like, oh, guys just struggle with porn and that's their thing. And just gave them a little bit more grace than girls had. Mm-hmm. And so I think that put a lot of shame on girls. I know I had a lot of shame, and it put a lot of unrealistic expectations.
Yes.
And it really put marriage and sex as like an idol. It made it
Yes.
an idol. And again, this wasn't all directly said, but it was
Heavily implied.
heavily implied. Yes. And like Sierra and I were just talking before, and we're like, our parents never told us this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but we heard it from
Yes.
the Christian culture all around us.
And I've heard that from so many people, like the friends that I talked to about this and just other people I've listened to about this.
Mm-hmm.
They all seem to say, it wasn't my parents teaching me this, which is just so interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It just goes to show you how powerful peers' influences are.
Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, so that's purity culture in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
And now we see the pendulum swinging the other way,
Right.
which is super fascinating and heartbreaking. But yeah.
Yeah, we see that. And that's kind of what we wanted to get on today. And we wanted to talk about, well, we don't believe in everything that the purity culture had to teach us, because we don't believe that that was biblical. But then swinging back over to the side of sleeping around and, you know,
Yeah.
the free love, as you said, that's not the right approach either.
Right.
That's not biblical and it's not healthy.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to talk about the middle
Yeah.
ground. And
Yep. I think more for this pendulum swinging the other way, I think it's more this time around about like women empowerment and you're empowered to sleep with others. And as opposed to like the free love movement was like, oh, you can just love a whole bunch of people at a time. And so it's a little bit different, but it's also part of the deconstruction movement. So
how did we see, we kind of just talked about this a little bit, but how did we see more in detail purity culture affecting young people, or how did it affect you personally?
yeah. For me personally, like that honestly became like the focus for me. Like I was into Christian romance novels. Thank you very much. Which, by the way, also are so unrealistic. Just like in those books, they never had temptation. And I was like, that is not realistic. So I really focused on marriage being the end goal, and like it must be the best thing ever to be in love with somebody, and just really made that an idol, made sex an idol, I think, for a lot of people my age that grew up in the purity movement. So we're like, Felicia Masonheimer once admitted this, that she prayed, God, do not come back until I've had sex. And I laughed so hard when I heard that, because I was like, I'm not the only one who prayed that.
Right.
Like, oh my gosh. And the question became for young people, I think, okay, if I can't have sex before marriage, what can I get away with?
Yeah. How far can you get?
How far can I go? And well, making out, laying down on a bed together, like how far can I go to get this little burst of pleasure, without crossing the line?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a question that honors God.
Right.
And the question should be, how can I honor God in this relationship?
Yes.
But that wasn't the question. That was the question was, how far can I go? And even with me, I wasn't allowed to date until I was 18, which I think is another product of purity culture. But I was actually thankful for that. But I was like, okay, well, I can't have sex right now because I'm not married. I can fantasize, I can do other things to like keep me preoccupied until I get this holy grail, like get to this holy grail moment. And so I think a lot of people just put their focus on that. A lot of kids our age put their focus on that. And it brought a lot of shame. It brought a lot of shame if you weren't perfect.
Right.
So,
yeah.
And there were a lot of like rules to follow that aren't even
sure.
biblical. like the skirt length and everything and shirts and, and again, this was for girls.
Right.
This was all for girls.
Yeah. The
Because
legalism.
The legalism. The assumption was boys are more visual anyways. We can't stop them from that. So we'll just focus on the girls and put rules in there. I don't think I ever saw rules for boys.
No.
Did you?
No, never.
Yeah. I never saw rules for boys either. And it was always like, oh, your skirt has to be a certain length. Your top has to be a certain cut, which for me was hard.
Yeah.
And so that was it was not biblical. And each person has to have discernment from Holy Spirit on what to wear, But there were all of these rules just laid out. The insinuation was, if you don't follow these rules, you're not as holy as, Rebecca St. James over there.
Right.
So,
right.
Who wore like a turtleneck under a tank top or something like that.
I think for me, it came down to like you just said, blaming the girls and putting all of the weight of that responsibility on the girls. So it was what we wore, and it could cause our brothers in Christ to stumble. So while I definitely believe that modesty is important, because we absolutely should not be walking around with parts of our body showing, God, that's not what God is calling us to. It's more the extent that it was taken to. But if we are trying to take off a sweatshirt and that's causing somebody to stumble, part of that responsibility has to be on that person who is struggling. Now, Romans does talk about not to be a stumbling block for our fellow believers. So we need to make sure that we take that seriously. I don't want to disregard that. However, I think there's also personal responsibility that's really important in this whole thing. James 4:17 says, "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." That verse just talks about personal responsibility in our faith. We can absolutely, as fellow believers, help our brothers and sisters in Christ out and not try to be a stumbling block. But there's also that personal responsibility part that needs to be taken into consideration. And within purity culture circles, it just wasn't. I remember there was a very popular book when I was in my early teens, and that had a blog, because I feel like I'm dating myself by even saying I read a blog, honestly. But there was a blog it was for younger teens, and it was about being mature, had great motives. I actually really liked the book itself. It was called Do Hard Things, and it was just about being mature and not succumbing to like the stereotypical teenager with no responsibility. But their blog site had a survey that they had asked young men to fill out and answer these questions on what to these guys was a stumbling block when a girl did blank. And so it would give a scenario, and the guys would then rate on a scale of like 1 to 5 how much it was a stumbling block to them.
Oh my gosh.
And the scenario, I don't remember everything. I think that it could have been, everything from wearing, a revealing swimsuit when you're at a beach or something, which I get that can be immodest. But then it went also to things like putting on chapstick and whether that was tempting to them or taking off your sweatshirt. And I think back to that, and I think, okay, that's kind of ridiculous, but it still puts that in your mind. Like, I have to be careful when I'm putting on chapstick. My lips are dry.
Well, and then how much of that is a disservice to young men who are like, I'm this weak.
Yes.
I stumble when a girl puts on chapstick. It doesn't give them any no, I can honor and respect girls.
Yes.
It instead makes them out to be a stumbling moron. And that's just not true. Like, my husband, his mom and dad raised him to be a very respectful young man. Mm-hmm. And he is when we were dating, well, okay, he still opens car doors for me, but when we were dating especially, I was so surprised that he opened car doors for me. And
That's so
he
nice.
was just raised to be an amazing young man. And then they're like, "Oh no, boys, you're visual. You'll stumble at anything." It's just ridiculous.
We think so little of them.
We think so little of them, and that's not God's heart.
It's so hard. I've always been bothered by this thought of like when anybody will say it to you, "Oh, boys just want one thing."
Yeah.
And
boys will be boys.
exactly. And I've always been bothered by
Yeah.
that, but I've never really until recently been able to say why. But we're putting so little on them.
Yeah.
And it's like we have no faith in men. And that's just not okay.
No, exactly.
Because they are made in the image of God too. And they have strength and they have the ability to have self-control.
Exactly.
But we need to, I'm going to say it, we need to empower men more to do it. To have that self-control.
Totally. And I think purity culture too brought in a sense of if you think it, you've sinned. That's not true. And that's not biblical. When you think it, you have the ability to capture that thought and be like, okay, God, I give this to you.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
If you see a girl or a guy and you're turned on, then you can, by what they're doing, then you can immediately give that to God. Mm-hmm. If those thoughts, are going in a bad direction. And purity culture was like, you can't have these thoughts until you're married. Well, how are you supposed to you're supposed to turn it off, and then once you're married, you're supposed to turn it on. That's just not realistic at all.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just talk about lust really quick, because I guess for me, growing up in purity culture, in youth group, in a girls' discipleship group, whatever it would have been, they would say, do not lust, which the Bible is very clear about. Jesus says it in Matthew that anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And of course, that goes for both men and women. But I want to admit that lust was never defined. And so honestly, until recently, I didn't know actually what being lustful was. So lust is a very strong sexual desire, is how it is defined. And really, it's desiring somebody in that sexual way. And that is what is considered a sin. And Jesus says that, as I just read, that if you are lusting after somebody, that is committing adultery in your heart. But honestly, growing up, what I would have thought lust was even just thinking about a crush, or or thinking, oh, this guy's really good looking, and being attracted to somebody. But that is not lust. And so that's where this balance comes in, because a lot of times they added more rules than God did. In the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments, one of the 10 Commandments is that you should not commit adultery. And the verse I just read to you in Matthew is actually Jesus adding to that instruction, saying, no, if you are lustful after a woman, you have committed adultery in your heart. But he doesn't say you can't find the opposite sex attractive. He does not say that. And look, I know that we're coming from a female perspective right now, but the thing is that these same things affected both guys and girls, maybe slightly differently, but almost the same. Guys were made to believe that even talking to a girl was flirting. And it almost put pressure on them that they were going to have to pursue that girl if they even went up and started a conversation. And since they were the ones painted to have so much weakness in the area of sexuality, any struggles in that area became secretive, and it's something to hide, and therefore led to a lot of shame. And so I know that as Rachel and I are talking here, we're talking a lot from a female perspective, but really there are a lot of similarities between how the guys were affected and how the girls were affected. I also think another thing is that I feel like when I was in a class or at a conference or whatever it was going to be where this subject would come up, it would always be like, well, if you do A, B, and C right, then your marriage will be fantastic. You will meet the man of your dreams and everything will be great.
Yep.
And coming from somebody who kind of followed, the rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm still single and
yeah.
That prosperity gospel didn't really work for me. And the whole point of my saying that is that it's not guaranteed.
Exactly.
And it's this false, it's these false promises.
Yeah.
And it just became this legalistic thing. Well, you're just following these rules.
Yep.
To get the perfect marriage or to find the perfect guy.
Yep.
No, we need to be praying over what our boundaries are and where our standards are.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, making our choices on what decisions we're going to be making, because our goal should not be to get the perfect guy. It should be to honor Christ.
To honor Christ. Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say is like our entire purpose in this life is to obey Christ and to honor Christ and to follow him. So whether or not we're going to get married, whether or not we're going to have that perfect marriage, we obey what he says because his ways are so much better than ours.
I am so sorry to interrupt, but I am actually going to pause this conversation for this week. Next week, Rachel and I will be back to continue this conversation on purity culture. We just had so much to say that we need a part 2. So make sure to stay tuned next week. I hope that you have been encouraged so far, and I hope that this has encouraged you to consider how we live as Christians in purity without becoming legalistic, but also without swinging to the other side of the spectrum and living as the world does. So make sure to tune in next week and we will see you then. Thanks so much for joining us on today's episode. I am so glad to have had this conversation with you. I am praying that this episode was encouraging, and if it was, please consider leaving a review. This show is just getting started, and we would love to bring more people into our conversation. Sharing it with your friends and leaving a review is a great way to do that. See you next time.